High in the canopy, a shadow shifts. A small marsupial grips the bark of a eucalyptus, pausing for a heartbeat. Then it leaps. A soft membrane unfurls, catching the air, and the animal glides in a long, silent arc through the moonlit forest. This is one of the wrist-winged gliders, a group of possums that took to the air. But how did a possum end up gliding like a flying squirrel? Across Australia and New Guinea, the genus Petaurus has become the most familiar of these gliders. Big eyes, delicate patagium, and an ability to cross the canopy without ever touching the ground. But behind that familiar image lies a deeper mystery. Why did gliding evolve multiple times in this part of the world? And how did Petaurus diversify into so many forms, from widespread generalists to tiny isolated endemics? In this video, we'll explore their evolutionary origins, their ecology, and the taxonomic confusion that still surrounds them, revealing a lineage far more complex than its cute reputation suggests. If you'd like to learn more, check out the document in the description with research papers and image credits. When most people picture a gliding mammal, they think of flying squirrels. But across Australia and New Guinea, an entirely different group has taken to the air. These are the wrist-winged gliders, small marsupials that move through the canopy with an ease that belies their size. At the heart of this ability is the patagium, a thin membrane of skin stretching from the wrist to the ankle. When the animal leaps, this membrane fans out into a broad surface that catches the air, allowing it to glide dozens of meters in a single jump. A specialized spur of cartilage at the wrist helps to tension the membrane, giving the glider control over its shape and angle. Behind them, a long, bushy tail acts as a rudder, letting the animal pitch and turn with remarkable precision. Gliding offers several advantages in the forests of Australasia. It allows the possums to travel between feeding sites without descending to the forest floor, where predators are more common. It conserves energy, reducing the need for long, inefficient climbs. And it expands their nightly foraging range, letting them exploit more dispersed food sources scattered through the canopy. What makes this story even more remarkable is the variety of gliding marsupials in these forests. The wrist-winged gliders differ greatly in size and form from the larger greater gliders and the tiny feathertail glider, yet all share the ability to move through the canopy using extended membranes. It's within this broader radiation of gliding marsupials that we find Petaurus, the group at the center of today's video. Understanding how these animals glide sets the stage for a bigger puzzle. Where does Petaurus fit in this tangle of gliding lineages? And why did so many of them evolve in the same part of the world? Before we go any further, it's worth grounding ourselves in what a marsupial actually is. Marsupials are one of the three major branches of living mammals, alongside the placentals and the egg-laying monotremes. Their defining feature isn't the pouch itself, not all marsupials have one, but their distinctive mode of reproduction. Marsupial young are born at a remarkably early stage, essentially still embryonic, and most of their development happens outside the womb, usually attached to a teat and often within a pouch. For those more familiar with American animals, it's worth clarifying that possums and opossums are not the same. Opossums are an order of New World marsupials. The possums are still marsupials, but are native to Australasia and are placed in a very different order despite their confusingly similar names. So where do these gliding possums sit on the marsupial family tree? Possums are part of the order Diprotodontia, which also includes kangaroos, koalas, wombats, and many of the other familiar Australian species. Within that order, we find the superfamily Pteroidea, the real starting point for our story today. The first family here is Acrobatidae, the feathertail possums. There are just three species, highly distinctive with tails covered in stiff bristles, giving them a feathered appearance. Interestingly, two of these species glide, the feather-tailed gliders, but the third one does not. Keep that in mind as we move on, it will become important soon. Next is a single species family with only the honey possum. This tiny marsupial is an important pollinator in southwestern Australia, feeding on nectar and pollen. More relevant to our story, though, is that it does not glide. Then we have the two largest families. Pseudocheridae includes 14 species spread across 5 genera. Most are ringtail possums, arboreal with prehensile tails, perfect for grasping branches. But this family also includes 3 gliding species, the greater gliders in the genus Pteroides. Finally, Pteroidae contains mostly gliding species, including the wrist-winged gliders, but also non-gliding members like the striped possum, several species of triox, and leadbeater's possum. Already a pattern emerges. Within Pteroidea, gliding appears in some species, but not their closest relatives. This hints at a key point. Similar lifestyles have evolved independently in multiple lineages. That's the story of convergent evolution, and it's exactly what makes reconstructing these marsupial relationships so fascinating, and sometimes challenging. A phylogeny is a simplified diagram of evolutionary history, showing how species are related over time. Each branch that splits represents a last common ancestor, a hypothetical population from which multiple lineages diverged. Take the branch where Acrobatidae splits from the rest of the superfamily. That split marks the last common ancestor of all possums in the superfamily. From that point, separate populations evolved in different directions, one leading to the modern feathertail possums, the other to the remaining families. But here's the key point. That ancestor probably didn't glide. We know this because gliding appears in lineages that are widely separated across the tree. The feathertail glider, the greater gliders, and the wrist-winged gliders. These species are not each other's closest relatives. The simplest explanation for this is that each lineage evolved the ability to glide independently. This is convergent evolution. Different evolutionary lines developing similar traits in response to similar ecological challenges. In Pteroidea, gliding evolved multiple times as a solution to moving efficiently through the canopy, avoiding predators, and exploiting food in the treetops. Convergent evolution also explains why reconstructing phylogenies can be tricky. Relying solely on visible traits, like gliding membranes, might falsely suggest close relationships. Genetics revealed a different story. Similar adaptations can arise independently, obscuring the true evolutionary paths. Now, I realize I promised you cute gliders at the start, but we've been sidetracked with evolutionary history. So let's return to the wrist-winged gliders, Pterois. Unlike the scattered gliders of Pteroidea, this genus represents a single lineage in which gliding evolved once. But the story doesn't stop there. The ancestors of Pterois likely arose in forested Australia during the Miocene, around 15 to 20 million years ago. Vast continuous forests covered much of the continent. Over millions of years, climate shifts and forest fragmentation created isolated pockets of habitat. Populations that were once connected became separated, each evolving along its own trajectory. This long process of isolation and divergence gave rise to the cryptic diversity we see today. What was once thought to be a single, widespread species, the sugar glider, Pterois breviceps, is actually a complex of genetically distinct species. Not one species, but many. Some occur in southeastern Australia, others in the tropical north, and a few extend into New Guinea, which represents a northward expansion rather than an independent evolution of gliding. Within Pteroidae, the wrist-winged gliders also have close non-gliding relatives. The striped possum in Triox and Dactylopsila, and leadbeater's possum in Gymnobellidaeus. These species remind us that gliding is just one evolutionary strategy. While Pterois developed membranes for moving through the canopy, their closest relatives pursued other adaptations to take advantage of their own niches. This combination of cryptic diversity, geography, and evolutionary relationships sets the stage for understanding the ecology and behavior of each species, from sugar gliders to the lesser-known mahogany and squirrel gliders. It's a story of hidden complexity shaped by millions of years of isolation and adaptation. For decades, researchers believed there was just one widespread species, the sugar glider. It seemed to stretch across eastern Australia, up into the tropics, and even into New Guinea. But once genetic studies finally caught up, that tidy picture fell apart. What looked like a single species turned out to be several, each occupying its own region, each with its own ecological quirks, and each shaped by millions of years of isolation. So how many species are we talking about? At present, there are 8 recognized species of Ptoris, though it does seem increasingly likely that 1 or 2 more will be added in the future. Starting with the Australian species, the sugar glider is the one most people recognize. For decades it was thought to be widespread across most of eastern Australia, but the recent genetic revision dramatically shrank that range. It's now confined mainly to coastal forests in the southeast, where it overlaps with several other glider species. One of those is the yellow-bellied glider. This is the largest species in the genus, weighing up to 700 grams, roughly the size of a small rabbit, and ranging widely through southeastern Australia. The squirrel glider is even more widespread along the eastern coast, from the tropical rainforest of northern Queensland to the drier woodlands in Victoria. The mahogany glider is one of Australia's rarest mammals, only found in a small section of coastal forest in northeastern Australia. Crefts glider is one of 2 species named in the most recent taxonomic revision, only in 2021. Much of the sugar glider's former range now belongs to this species, which is common along the eastern seaboard. Because it was only recently recognised, its exact range boundaries are still being refined. The other newly identified species is the savanna glider, found throughout much of northern Australia, from Queensland through to large areas of the Northern Territory, reaching far further west than any of the other Australian Ptoris species. That leaves the New Guinea species, of which 2 have been formally described, although more almost certainly await recognition. The northern glider is the main one, occupying a very small area of Papua New Guinea and known from only a tiny population. The final named species is the Biak glider, found exclusively on a small island off the northern coast of New Guinea. This species is interesting, mostly due to how little is known about it. While the 2021 taxonomic revision analysed the genetics of the entire genus, the Biak glider was excluded from that research, and no earlier studies had included it either. As such, it is the one named species where we know nothing about its placement on the phylogeny. Now that we have met the species themselves, it's worth looking at how these animals actually live. And despite their similar appearance, gliders occupy a surprisingly wide range of habitats, from dense coastal forests to dry inland woodlands, tropical savannas, and even the mountains of New Guinea. What unites them is their reliance on trees. Every species in Ptoris depends on mature woodland with enough vertical structure to glide between. When the canopy breaks down, so does their ability to move, forage, and avoid predators. Most gliders are omnivores, but the balance of their diet varies. Sugar gliders, squirrel gliders, and crefts gliders feed on sap, gum, nectar, fruit, and insects. The yellow-bellied glider takes this even further, being a specialist sap feeder. They make deep incisions into eucalyptus bark to access the flowing sap underneath, behavior you simply don't see in the smaller species. The savanna glider, by contrast, lives in more open, seasonally dry habitats, relying heavily on flowering and insect activity to fuel its lifestyle. Their movement through the forest is shaped by one defining adaptation: the glide. Gliding isn't just an impressive trick, it's an energy-saving way of travelling between trees, usually from a higher launch point to a lower one. Short glides of 20 or 30 metres are typical, but in open woodland, some species can cross gaps of 70 metres or more. It allows them to cover their nightly routes efficiently, while avoiding the ground, where predators are a far greater threat. Social groups vary as well. Many gliders live in small family groups, often a breeding pair and their young, sharing a den hollow and maintaining a modest home range. Yellow-bellied gliders are the exception. They hold much larger territories and are far more vocal, broadcasting loud, distinctive calls through the forest at night to mark their boundaries. In contrast, the northern glider remains something of an ecological mystery, with so few individuals ever observed. Even basic information about its social structure and behaviour is still unknown. Across the genus, gliders are nocturnal. They den in tree hollows, and many are strongly seasonal in their behaviour. During colder months or periods of food shortage, several species can enter short bouts of torpor to conserve energy. This is a crucial part of their survival strategy. Small mammals have extremely high metabolic demands, and Petaurus species rely heavily on high-energy foods like nectar and sap to sustain themselves. When those foods are unavailable, torpor acts as an emergency energy-saving mode. Body temperature drops, activity slows, and their metabolic rate plummets, allowing them to endure brief shortages that would otherwise be life-threatening. Some species can remain torpid for several hours at a time, and even synchronize torpor within family groups to reduce heat loss inside shared dens. Their breeding cycle follows the typical marsupial pattern, a short gestation, but followed by months of pouch development and extended dependence in the den. And this brings us to the crucial point. For many of these species, their ecology depends on features of the forest that take decades, sometimes more than a century, to form. The right mix of flowering trees, intact canopy, and old-growth hollows isn't just beneficial, it's essential. When we look at conservation, the story shifts dramatically. While some species in Petaurus remain relatively secure, others are right at the edge. Let's start with the most endangered, the northern glider of Papua New Guinea. This species is listed as critically endangered, and its known range is tiny, restricted to a small mountainous region in the north. Habitat loss from logging and agricultural expansion continue to shrink what little forest remains, and because the population is so small, any further decline would be catastrophic. Very few surveys have been completed, so there's still uncertainty about how many remain, but the trend is not promising. Australia's most threatened member of the genus is the mahogany glider. Initially collected in 1886, it was then presumed extinct for more than a century, until it was recognised as part of the sugar glider complex in the early 1990s. But almost as soon as it was rediscovered, it became clear that the species was in serious trouble. Its range is incredibly restricted, confined to a narrow strip of coastal Queensland. Much of its habitat has been cleared for agriculture, leaving thin, fragmented ribbons of forest that are difficult for gliders to move between. Because mahogany gliders avoid crossing open ground, fragmentation isolates populations, reduces gene flow, and increases the risk of local extinctions. As a result, the mahogany glider is now considered one of Australia's most threatened mammals. Other species face more moderate but still serious pressures. Squirrel gliders and Kreft's gliders have experienced widespread habitat loss in eastern Australia, especially in regions where old hollow-bearing trees have been removed. Without those hollows, breeding opportunities decline sharply. Even selective logging can be harmful, because it takes decades, sometimes over a century, for new hollows to form. In northern Australia, the savanna glider is dealing with shifting fire regimes. More frequent and intense burns can reduce flowering events and alter tree composition, cutting into seasonal pulses of nectar and insects these gliders rely on. And while the species isn't currently considered threatened, its habitat is changing faster than its ecology may be able to keep up with. The yellow-bellied glider, despite its larger range, is also vulnerable to local declines. Its dependence on mature eucalyptus forests makes it particularly sensitive to logging and landscape-scale changes in forest structure. And then we have the species we know little about, the Biak glider, along with several unnamed populations in New Guinea and northern Australia. Without genetic data, their conservation status is impossible to assess. They could be secure, or there could be distinct lineages already slipping towards extinction without ever being formally recognised. And what this all means is that conservation for Petaurus doesn't end with identifying species. It begins there. The more clearly we understand their taxonomy and population structure, the better we can target conservation efforts, before more lineages become endangered, simply because we didn't realise they existed. But even for the species we do know, the challenges are substantial. The mahogany glider, for example, lives in one of the most heavily fragmented landscapes in Queensland, with many remaining patches now too small or too isolated to sustain long-term populations. Recovery plans call for restoring habitat corridors, protecting remaining forest, and working with local landholders to reconnect the landscape. These efforts are slow, but they are happening, and in several areas, corridor plantings are already beginning to bridge formerly isolated patches. The northern glider faces a different challenge altogether. Extreme rarity paired with lack of basic data. It's known from only a handful of locations in Papua New Guinea, and much of its remaining habitat is remote, mountainous, and difficult to access. Fieldwork in these regions can be slow and expensive, and ongoing social and logistical barriers, from limited infrastructure to local security concerns, make sustained surveys even harder. As a result, we still don't know how many northern gliders remain, how fragmented their populations are, or what habitats they rely on most strongly. Despite these challenges, there is some hope. Where habitat is protected and connectivity improves, glider populations can recover surprisingly well. These animals reproduce quickly, disperse readily through continuous canopy, and thrive in healthy woodland. The tools for protecting them are well understood. Safeguarding old-growth trees with hollows, limiting clearing, restoring corridors, and supporting research to clarify where each species actually occurs. The real challenge is applying these tools in time. In the end, the wrist-winged gliders of Botauris are a reminder that even familiar animals can hold stories we've only just begun to uncover. For decades, these species were treated as variations of the same small, wide-eyed possum drifting through Australia's woodlands. But once we looked closer, through genetics, ecology, and a better understanding of their history, an entirely different picture emerged. A picture of ancient forests splitting and reforming, of lineages diverging quietly in the canopy, of species hiding in plain sight, separated not by appearance, but by deep evolutionary history. Gliding itself may have evolved multiple times in the larger clade, but the wrist-winged gliders are just one of these lineages. Yet their diversity reflects millions of years of adaptations to different climate, forests, and landscapes across Australia and New Guinea. And while each one is still recognisably a glider, each carries a distinct piece of that evolutionary journey. Some species are widespread and resilient. Others, like the mahogany glider, face a far more uncertain future. Understanding who they are, where they live, and how they're related isn't just an academic exercise. It's the foundation of protecting them. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the world of wrist-winged gliders. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and keep learning. There's still so much to discover about the world's rare and remarkable species, and the more we understand, the better our chances of protecting them. Thanks for watching.